The morning after my aunt's funeral, I opened my front door to find two armed police officers and a crisis intervention team specialist standing on my porch. The specialist held a heavy metal clipboard. Clipped to the top was an emergency medical evaluation order bearing my name. My mother had called them. She told the dispatcher I was experiencing a severe emotional crisis and posed a serious danger. But the real reason they were standing on my welcome mat was parked at the end of my driveway. My older brother Jason was leaning against his car, arms crossed. He was waiting for me to be dragged out in a squad car, so he could seize control of the $4.2 million estate I had just inherited. My name is Olivia. I'm 35 years old. Welcome to Sweet Karma Life. Before I explain exactly how I used my corporate data security background to legally strip my family of everything they owned, please like and subscribe. Drop your age and location in the comments below. I want to know who is listening today. Now, let me take you to that cold Tuesday morning. It was barely 8 o'clock. I stood in the doorway wearing a terry cloth bathrobe, my bare feet on the hardwood floor. The lead officer kept his right hand resting casually over his duty belt. His partner scanned the foyer behind me. The CIT specialist stepped forward. She spoke in a slow, patronizing whisper, the kind of voice professionals use to soothe a dangerous animal. She said my mother, Brenda, was terrified for my safety. The lie was breathtaking. Brenda lived 1,000 miles away in a gated Florida community. For the past 5 years, she spent her afternoons drinking mimosas at the country club while I spoon-fed Aunt Vivian pureed food and managed her late-stage dementia. Brenda never visited. Jason never called. They abandoned the woman who raised them. But 48 hours ago at the lawyer's office, the will was read. Vivian left every asset to me. Jason and Brenda screamed in the conference room. They promised they would fix the situation. I looked past the uniform on my porch. Jason met my gaze from the street. He offered a tight, arrogant smile. He is 38 years old, a man with 3 bankrupt tech companies and debts he hides from his wife. His plan was brutally patient. A mandatory psychiatric hold would establish a documented history of severe mental instability. By noon, Jason's lawyer would file an emergency petition with the probate court, arguing I was unfit to inherit. He would have himself named as my permanent conservator, granting him absolute legal authority to siphon the $4.2 million over time, legally hiding his theft behind the veil of my supposed care. The lead officer cleared his throat, snapping my attention back. He stated they needed to come inside. They had to secure the premises and search for the items my mother reported. I work as a corporate data compliance officer. My entire career is built on analyzing risk and recognizing anomalies. I knew arguing would look erratic. Screaming would validate their paperwork. I had to remain compliant. I agreed to let them in and stepped back. As the door swung wide, I glanced one last time at the street. Jason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of metal, letting it catch the morning light. A cold realization washed over me. It was the spare house key that vanished from my kitchen counter during the post-funeral reception. He had not just sent the police. He had already been inside. I stepped back, pulling the collar of my robe tighter against the morning chill. The lead officer crossed the threshold, his hand resting instinctively on his duty belt. His partner followed close behind, his eyes scanning the space for immediate threats. The state medical expert walked in last, her sensible shoes clicking against the hardwood. As they moved into the foyer, the momentum of their entrance faltered. The visual reality of my home collided violently with the panicked narrative my mother had fed the emergency dispatcher. The morning light poured through the tall windows, illuminating a spotless living space. There was no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no unwashed dishes piled in the sink. The hardwood floors were swept clean. The throw pillows on the velvet sofa sat aligned in perfect symmetry. On the dining room table, my work laptop rested neatly beside a stack of organized corporate audit files. The officers exchanged a brief, confused glance. They had been dispatched to secure a manic individual on the verge of a violent collapse. Instead, they found a quiet professional standing in a pristine, ordered sanctuary. As the second officer began opening the hallway closets, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, the tense silence in the room dragged me back to Mr. Harrison's law office. The memory was barely 48 hours old. The smell of old paper, lemon polish, and leather chairs still lingered in my mind. Brenda had arrived wearing a heavy black veil, playing the role of the devastated sister. Jason sat beside her, checking his expensive watch, tapping his designer shoes on the thick carpet. They were expecting a quick payday. They were expecting the reward for surviving a relative they had ignored for a decade. When the attorney broke the heavy wax seal on Vivian's final testament, the temperature in the room plummeted. Vivian's legal phrasing was precise and unforgiving. She left her entire estate, liquid assets, and properties to me. The document explicitly cited 10 years of systemic neglect by her sister and nephew, noting their refusal to assist with her medical care or visit her during her final cognitive decline. When Mr. Harrison read the final figure aloud, $4.2 million, Brenda ripped her veil off. Her performative grief evaporated in an instant. She slammed her hands down on the mahogany desk, demanding to know how I manipulated a dying woman with dementia. Jason did not yell. He leaned forward, the veins standing out on his neck, his face pale. He pointed a finger at my chest and stated they would fix this. He promised I would not see a single dime. The heavy thud of the CIT specialist's clipboard hitting my kitchen island pulled me out of the memory. She pulled out a bar stool and sat down, gesturing for me to stand opposite her. The cold granite counter felt like a physical barrier between my sanity and their manufactured nightmare. She reached into her dark leather tote bag and produced a thick stack of printed screenshots. She laid them out in a neat, overlapping row under the kitchen pendant lights. They were text messages, allegedly sent from my personal cell phone number to Brenda's phone in Florida. The timestamps printed at the top of the pages read between 2 and 3 in the morning. I looked down at the glossy paper. The messages were erratic, typed in aggressive all caps, filled with disjointed threats and dark confessions of deep mental instability. The digital phantom claiming to be me wrote about hearing voices scratching in the walls. The text detailed troubling intentions to escape the crushing pressure of the inheritance. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a fast primal rhythm. The instinct to defend myself, to scream that these messages were spoofed or faked, burned in my throat. But I have spent the last 10 years working in corporate data compliance. My entire career revolves around neutralizing panic when a secure network breach occurs. Panic creates unforced errors. Silence extracts valuable information. I clamped my jaw shut and forced my breathing to slow. I observed the spacing of the text bubbles, the calculated errors in spelling designed to mimic a manic episode, the specific phrasing that sounded exactly like Jason's speech patterns. I maintained total composure. I let my silence stretch, unnerving the specialist who was waiting for a hysterical denial. Before she could prompt me to explain the printed threats, a sharp voice echoed from down the hall. The second officer stepped out of the guest bedroom. The guest room was the only space in the house I rarely entered since Vivian passed away. He walked into the harsh kitchen light, his jaw set tight, his expression hardening into authority. In his left hand, he held a clear plastic evidence bag containing a crushed pile of white substances and several dangerous items. In his right hand, he held a worn, spiral-bound notebook. He placed the items on the island next to the forged text messages. He flipped the notebook open to a dog-eared page. The handwriting was a near-perfect replica of my own. The sweeping loops on the letters, the leftward slant of the paragraphs. It was a diary of a woman losing her grip on reality, detailing plans for a dark outcome and anyone who tried to step foot on the property. Jason had not just planted substances in my house. He had clearly spent hours studying my old birthday cards and college letters, meticulously forging a descent into madness. The sheer level of premeditation turned my blood cold. He was willing to destroy my freedom, force state doctors to intervene, and label me a permanent danger to society. all to secure a conservatorship and clear his hidden debts. The CIT specialist leaned over and traced the forged handwriting with her index finger. She nodded slowly, her face settling into a mask of grim professional certainty. The contrast between my calm demeanor and the fabricated evidence no longer mattered to her. The confirmation bias was locked in. In her eyes, I was simply a highly functional individual, masking a severe break from reality. The physical presence of the substances and the disturbing journal provided the probable cause they needed. She looked at the lead officer and gave a curt nod. She did not need to diagnose me. She just needed to authorize my mandatory transport to the hospital ward for a medical evaluation. She tapped her pen against her clipboard, legally greenlighting my detention. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from investigation to apprehension. The lead officer shifted his weight, squaring his shoulders toward me. He placed his right hand firmly on his duty belt. The harsh sound of a heavy metal snap broke the silence as he unclipped his handcuff pouch. He took a calculated step toward me, closing the distance between the island and the foyer. He kept his voice low, firm, and authoritative, instructing me to place my hands behind my back and come quietly. The trap was locked. Jason's plan was seconds away from a flawless execution. I needed to shatter their reality before cold steel closed around my wrists. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands. But as the lead officer closed the distance, his shadow swallowing my space, a traitorous wave of Arctic adrenaline washed down my spine, making me want to curl into a defensive ball. Every data compliance protocol I knew became a lifeline. I anchored my bare feet to the freezing hardwood, forcing a brutal rigidity into my posture. The rapid-fire click of my fingernails biting deep into my own palms became the bass rhythm of my entire universe, the stabs of pain the only thing keeping the rising bile of panic at bay. I knew that if my lips trembled even a fraction of an inch, the thin illusion of my sanity would shatter, and my legal identity would be erased. I locked eyes with the officer, channeling 10 years of analyzing high-level network breaches into a singular icy stare. My voice came out not just flat, but utterly mechanical, stripped of any human variance as I commanded him to look past the planted notebook. 2:15. The time struck a very specific dark chord. It was the exact hour Jason usually made his desperate phone calls when his schemes collapsed. 3 years ago, my parents liquidated $200,000 from their joint retirement accounts in the middle of the night. They did it quietly, transferring the funds to cover Jason's catastrophic losses in a fraudulent cryptocurrency exchange. He owed money to men who did not file civil lawsuits when debts went unpaid. My mother labeled his failures as bad luck. My father called it a temporary setback for an aspiring entrepreneur. Meanwhile, I spent my college years working graveyard shifts at a data processing center to cover my tuition. They never offered me a dime. Jason was their protected investment. I was their invisible safety net. Now, his shady creditors were closing in again. He needed liquid capital immediately. Aunt Vivian's $4.2 million estate was the perfect, tragic windfall to erase his mistakes. He just needed me out of the way. I broke the tense silence in the room. I instructed the lead officer to look at the silver laptop resting on my dining room table. I explained that from midnight until 4 a.m, my devices were locked into a heavily monitored corporate network for an international audit. During that entire window, every single keystroke was actively logged. My personal cell phone was tethered to that same secure network. It is physically impossible to send an outbound text message from that device without the corporate firewall instantly flagging it. If I had sent those manic threats at 2:15, the security software would have recorded the breach and immediately terminated my connection. My alibi wasn't just a convenient story. It was a permanent, encrypted digital footprint. I told the officers they could call my firm's security director right now to verify the exact timestamp of every button I pushed last night. The officers exchanged a heavy, loaded look. The lead cop let his hand drift away from his duty belt. He understood digital evidence. He recognized the difference between a hysterical suspect and a corporate professional offering verifiable federal data. The fabricated narrative was fracturing. But the CIT specialist refused to yield. She slapped her hand flat against the kitchen island, the smack ringing out like a gunshot. She pointed a manicured finger at the plastic evidence bag holding the crushed white powder and the forged notebook. She argued forcefully that digital server logs did not negate physical reality. She claimed individuals experiencing psychotic breaks still log into work. The narcotics were real. The suicidal journal was physically present in my home. She insisted the threshold for a mandatory hospital transport remained legally valid. The danger, she stated, was imminent and documented. She demanded the officers finish their job and detain me for evaluation. The trap tightened once again. The law was caught between concrete digital proof and the tangible weight of illegal pills sitting on my counter. The officer looked at his handcuffs, then back to me, the indecision clear in his jawline. A sharp, rhythmic tapping sound broke the standoff. We all turned our heads toward the foyer. Jason stood on the front porch. He pressed his face near the glass pane of the front door, shielding his eyes from the morning glare to peer inside. He wore a masterclass expression of fraternal concern, his brow furrowed in mock anxiety. He mouthed the words, "Is she okay?" through the thick glass. He tapped the pane again, acting like a terrified brother, desperate for an update on his unstable sibling. He wanted to watch the officers lock the steel cuffs around my wrists. He wanted to witness the exact moment his inheritance cleared probate. He needed visual confirmation that his forgery had worked. The lead officer took a tentative step toward the entryway to address him. I stepped smoothly into the officer's path, blocking his route to the door. I looked straight through the glass, locking my gaze directly onto Jason's fake, sympathetic eyes. I let a cold, deadpan smile stretch across my face. I did not break eye contact with the man trying to steal my freedom and my future. I spoke loudly enough for the police and the angry CIT specialist to hear every single syllable clearly. I asked the officers if they were familiar with the surveillance capabilities of a 4K resolution, motion-activated indoor mesh camera network. The air in the kitchen grew stagnant. The lead officer dropped his hand from his utility belt. He tilted his head, his gaze sweeping upward, scanning the corners of the ceiling, the edges of the crown molding, searching for the telltale glint of a lens. The CIT specialist froze in place. Her pen hovered a fraction of an inch above her evaluation notes. The heavy silence stretched, thick with sudden uncertainty. I did not give them a single moment to process the question. I seized control of the room. I explained my professional background again, stripping away the polite corporate jargon. I build digital fortresses designed to track, identify, and trap unauthorized users. This house was my personal domain. The network securing it was military grade. I needed the authorities to understand why a suburban residence operated under bank-level surveillance. The explanation rested on the tragic reality of the aunt my family had discarded. In the final 18 months of her life, Vivian suffered severe neurological decline. The dementia brought on a terrifying secondary condition known as sundowning. When daylight faded, her brain manufactured vivid, terrifying hallucinations. She became utterly convinced armed intruders were creeping through the hallways, waiting to attack her in her bed. She would pile heavy oak dining chairs against her bedroom door. She stopped sleeping entirely. The chronic fear was destroying her weakened heart. To offer her a sense of safety and to ensure I could monitor her physical well-being while I worked long hours, I retrofitted the entire property. I hired specialized private contractors. They spent 2 weeks installing high-definition microcameras. They embedded the lenses inside the smoke detectors, behind the metallic grates of the return air vents, and within the dark casing of the bookshelf speakers. Every square foot of the interior was mapped and covered. The system provided continuous recording capabilities, infrared night vision, and bidirectional audio feeds. The data bypassed vulnerable local hard drives. It uploaded directly to an off-site encrypted server farm. I paid for the entire system with my own salary to keep the woman who raised me safe from her own mind. I turned away from the plastic evidence bag resting on the counter. I walked toward my leather briefcase sitting on the dining chair. I unzipped the main compartment and retrieved a heavy tablet. The specialist slid off the tall bar stool. The clinical, condescending posture she had utilized to evaluate me vanished. A rigid, nervous energy took its place. She watched my hands closely. The officers stepped forward, drawn magnetically by the glowing screen. My fingers flew across the glass display. I inputted a complex, multi-tier alphanumeric passcode followed by a biometric fingerprint scan. The proprietary security application launched immediately. A dark gray grid containing 24 live camera feeds illuminated the kitchen island. The visual resolution was staggering. The colors were sharp, the contrast perfect. We could clearly see the front porch, the living room sofa, the long hallway, and the exact guest bedroom where the second officer had supposedly uncovered my descent into insanity. The lead officer let out a low whistle. He recognized commercial-grade technology. The forged paper document sitting next to the tablet suddenly looked amateurish and pathetic. Through the live feed of the front porch camera, we all watched my brother. Jason was still standing on the welcome mat. The thick glass of the entry door muffled our conversation, but he could read the shifting dynamics inside the house. He saw the uniformed men crowding around my device. He saw the silver handcuffs still resting securely in their black leather pouch. The confident, arrogant mask melted away, his shoulders tensed. He reached out and grabbed the heavy brass door handle, pressing down hard. The mechanism clicked loudly, but the reinforced steel deadbolt held firm. I had locked it the moment the officer stepped inside. Jason jiggled the handle violently, his knuckles turning stark white against the brass. He was locked out. The physical barrier held, but the elaborate trap he built was collapsing onto him in real time. He stepped back from the door, yanking his cell phone from his pocket. His thumb swiped frantically across the screen, likely trying to text our mother for a backup plan. He looked around the porch, his eyes darting toward the street, calculating his escape routes. He knew the timeline was falling apart. I ignored his rising panic. I focused the attention of the law enforcement officials on the digital grid. I tapped the specific icon for the guest bedroom. The multiple feeds vanished, replaced by a single expansive view of the empty room. I laid out the timeline for them. Yesterday afternoon, between the hours of 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock, the entire surviving family was gathered at the Trinity Church Hall. I was standing near the entrance doors, greeting attendees, accepting condolences, and managing the caterers. The house was supposed to be completely unoccupied. However, my digital security log generated an alert showing the front door keypad was accessed at exactly 2:45 in the afternoon. I placed my finger on the playback slider located at the bottom of the screen. I dragged it backward across the timeline. The digital timestamp raced in reverse. Night turned back into day. The shadows cast by the window blinds shifted rapidly across the guest room floor. I stopped the scrub at 2:44. The screen displayed the pristine room. The bed linens were perfectly tucked. The surfaces were devoid of any contraband. The lead officer leaned in, his nose inches from the glass. The specialist crossed her arms tight against her chest, chewing nervously on her lower lip. Her professional assessment was about to be destroyed by raw data. I dragged the audio slider on the right side of the tablet to its maximum output level. I tapped the triangular play icon. The digital clock ticked forward to 2:45. For a brief second, only the low hum of the central air conditioning played through the speakers. Then, a heavy metallic click echoed from the tablet as the front door unlocked. Heavy footsteps struck the hardwood floor in the hallway, growing louder by the second. A tall shadow fell across the guest room threshold. The crystal-clear audio of Jason, clearing his throat, filled the quiet kitchen. The high-definition video filled the screen of my tablet. The timestamp in the corner read 2:45 in the afternoon. The visual feed from the guest bedroom was sharp, capturing the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the blinds. The room was empty for exactly 3 seconds. Then, a tall figure stepped into the frame. He wore the same dark charcoal suit he had worn to the church service just an hour prior. He looked out of place, standing in the pristine, quiet room. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes darting toward the hallway, checking his blind spots. As he raised his hands, the overhead light caught the distinct blue shimmer of latex surgical gloves stretched tight over his fingers. He had come prepared. He was treating my home like a crime scene he was actively staging. The officers leaned over the kitchen island, their faces bathed in the glow of the screen. They watched in stunned silence as my brother reached into his inner suit pocket. He pulled out the clear plastic bag filled with crushed white powder. He walked over to the wooden nightstand beside the bed. He did not toss the bag haphazardly. He placed it with calculated precision, positioning it right next to the brass reading lamp so it would be impossible to miss during a preliminary search. Next, he reached into his trousers and withdrew the worn, spiral-bound notebook, the forged diary. He opened it to the middle, creasing the spine so it would lay flat. He positioned it beside the pills, ensuring the frantic fake handwriting was highly visible. He stepped back, inspecting his handiwork. He nodded to himself, a small, satisfied gesture of a man who believed he had just secured his financial future. Then, his cell phone vibrated. The sound was captured perfectly by the hidden ceiling microphones. Jason pulled the device from his pocket, swiped the screen, and tapped the speakerphone icon. He set the phone down on the edge of the mattress. A voice echoed from the tablet speakers. It was a voice I had known my entire life. It was a voice that had criticized my career, ignored my milestones, and constantly defended Jason's failures. It was my mother, Brenda. She sounded clear, sharp, and entirely devoid of the hysterical panic she had used on the emergency dispatcher this morning. "Did you plant the items?" Brenda asked. Her tone was brisk, the sound of a manager checking off a list. "Yeah, Mom," Jason replied. His voice bounced off the guest room walls. "Everything is set. The pills are out. The journal is open." Brenda sighed, a sound of profound relief. "Okay," she said. "Here is the timeline. I will call the police dispatcher tomorrow morning at 8. I will tell them she called me making violent threats. I will say she is armed, unstable, and a danger to herself. The cops will force their way inside to secure the premises. Once they find the drugs and that unhinged diary, they will have no choice. They will put her on a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric hold." Jason let out a short, hollow laugh. "And the money?" he asked. Brenda did not hesitate. "The second she is admitted to the ward," she stated, "your lawyer files the emergency petition with the probate judge. We use the involuntary hold to prove she is mentally unfit to execute Vivian's will. The court will freeze the probate process and name you her legal conservator. You will have full power of attorney. We can start liquidating the assets and siphoning the estate through management fees and care costs before she even gets discharged. By the time she tries to fight back, she will be legally incompetent and under your total financial control." I reached out and tapped the glass screen. The video paused. The audio cut off. The silence that descended upon my kitchen was heavy and absolute. The air felt thick, suffocating. The CIT specialist stood frozen beside the counter. All the color had drained from her face, leaving her skin a pale, ashen gray. She stared blankly at the paused frame of Jason smiling in the guest bedroom. She looked down at her heavy metal clipboard. The transport authorization paperwork lay there, bearing her notes confirming a severe psychological threat. She was a licensed professional. She understood the gravity of what had just transpired. She realized she was mere minutes away from participating in a felony medical kidnapping. She had been weaponized. Her authority had been manipulated to detain a sane woman and help steal her inheritance. Her hands began to shake. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and grabbed the thick stack of transport forms. She pulled them toward her chest and ripped them down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She stacked the torn halves and ripped them again, rendering her assessment permanently void. She dropped the pieces into the stainless steel trash can and backed away from the counter, putting physical distance between herself and the conspiracy. The reaction from the police officers was entirely different. The initial tension in their posture evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened fury. Law enforcement officers detest being lied to. they harbor a deep, systemic hatred for citizens who use emergency services as hired muscle for domestic extortion schemes. The second officer, the man who had discovered the planted evidence, turned his head slowly toward the front foyer. Through the glass pane of the front door, Jason was still pacing on the porch. He was checking his expensive watch, shifting his weight from foot to foot, wondering what was causing the delay. He was waiting for his sister to be dragged out in chains. The lead officer unclipped the radio receiver from his shoulder harness. He pressed the transmit button, his thumb pushing down hard. He spoke in a low, controlled growl. He contacted the central dispatch desk. He formally canceled the mental health hold, citing a fabricated report and fraudulent evidence. He instructed the dispatcher to clear the medical unit that was waiting down the street. The trap was broken. The narrative had shattered. The physical reality of the pills and the journal meant nothing against the undeniable, time-stamped proof of their origin. Conservatorship abuse is a dark, terrifying mechanism in the American legal system. With a single false report and a compliant doctor, a person can lose their autonomy, their finances, and their voice. My family knew this. They tried to use the system to bury me. Instead, they had handed me the exact tools I needed to destroy them. The lead officer clipped his radio back onto his uniform. He stepped around the kitchen island, closing the distance between us. He looked at me, then pointed a thick finger toward the front door. His voice was tight with suppressed anger. He listed the offenses: breaking and entering, trespassing, possession of a controlled substance, falsifying a police report, conspiracy to commit grand larceny. He squared his shoulders, ready for action. He asked me if I wanted him to unlock the deadbolt right now. He offered to walk out onto that porch, throw my brother against the siding of the house, and read him his rights while he locked the steel cuffs around his wrists. He offered me immediate retribution. I looked through the glass at Jason. He was rubbing his face, his frustration mounting. A quiet arrest on a suburban porch on a Tuesday morning was too clean. It was too easy. It lacked an audience. My family operated on appearances. They cared about their social standing, their country club reputation, and the carefully crafted illusion of their success. Taking that away in the shadows would not teach them anything. I turned back to the officer. I kept my voice perfectly level. I shook my head and told him no. I instructed him to leave the deadbolt locked. I told the officers I had a much better venue in mind for my brother's reckoning. I looked at the lead patrolman. His hand rested near his radio, waiting for my signal to move. I told him we were not going to arrest my brother quietly on the porch. A silent apprehension would allow my family to spin a comfortable narrative. They would claim it was a tragic misunderstanding or a simple dispute over property lines. I needed this failure documented under the harshest light possible. I explained that Aunt Vivian had already built the architecture of their downfall long before her mind began to betray her. 5 years ago, prior to her initial dementia diagnosis, Vivian possessed a razor-sharp intellect. She spent 4 decades building and running a regional logistics firm in a male-dominated industry. She understood human nature, and she was intimately familiar with the systemic greed infecting her own bloodline. When she realized her cognitive decline was an inevitable medical reality, she hired Arthur Harrison. He was not a standard suburban estate planner. Mr. Harrison was a bulldog litigator who spent his career fighting high-net-worth probate warfare in federal courtrooms. Together, they drafted a fortress of a legal document. I walked over to my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick legal-size envelope. I slid a notarized copy of the final testament across the granite island. I pointed to a specific paragraph located halfway down the 7th page. It was an in terrorem provision, commonly known in legal circles as a no-contest clause, but Harrison had engineered a much deadlier variation. Standard clauses simply state that anyone who challenges the will loses their share of the inheritance. Vivian went much further. She anticipated their exact strategy of using my mental health as a weapon. The document mandated that any family member attempting to interfere with my inheritance through frivolous litigation, fraudulent claims, or specifically medical sabotage, would provide grounds for an immediate and irrevocable disinheritance. Vivian had left Brenda and Jason token bequests of $10,000 each. It was a calculated trap. The law requires giving potential heirs a small, specified sum to prove to a judge they were not accidentally forgotten during the drafting process. By planting those narcotic pills and staging this psychiatric intervention, Jason had just handed me the exact, undeniable evidence required. With this police report and the camera footage, Harrison would file an expedited petition with the probate judge to activate the penalizing statute. Their token shares were about to be legally diverted to a local feline rescue shelter. The patrolman read the dense paragraph. A slow, appreciative grin spread across his face. He understood the financial ruin my brother had just walked into. The CIT specialist remained silent, staring blankly at the hardwood floor, processing the sheer magnitude of the liability she had just evaded by tearing up her transport authorization. The officers turned toward the foyer. They understood the assignment now. They were no longer investigating a manic woman. They were executing a trap set by a dead logistics executive. The lead cop reached out and twisted the heavy brass deadbolt. The front door swung inward. Jason stepped forward instantly. He adjusted the lapels of his charcoal jacket, projecting the pristine image of a concerned, grieving sibling. He looked past the dark blue uniforms, his eyes searching the hallway for me. He expected to see me in restraints, weeping, begging for my freedom. Instead, the two officers stepped out onto the porch and flanked him. The metallic rattle of the handcuffs echoed in the crisp morning air. The lead officer grabbed Jason by the right bicep and spun him around with practiced efficiency, forcing him against the exterior brick wall of my house. The Golden Boy facade shattered in a fraction of a second. Jason gasped, his chest hitting the rough masonry. He demanded to know what was happening. His voice cracked, rising an octave in sudden panic. He yelled that he was the victim, that I was the one threatening people in the middle of the night. The second officer ignored his protests. He grabbed my brother's left wrist, pulling it firmly behind his back. The steel cuff snapped shut with a heavy, fatalistic click. The patrolman recited the Miranda warning in a loud, monotonous voice, listing the charges of trespassing, filing a false police report, and possession of a controlled substance. Jason screamed my name. He thrashed against the brickwork, demanding I come outside and fix the situation. He shouted that our mother would hire a defense team to ruin my life. I stood in the doorway, my arms resting casually at my sides. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I only registered the cold, mechanical reality of a predator getting caught in his own snare. His entitlement was evaporating on the concrete driveway. I did not stay to watch them push his head down and shove him into the back of the black and white police cruiser. I turned my back on the front yard and walked up the carpeted stairs to my master bedroom. The initial skirmish was over, but the actual war required a public audience. I stripped off the terry cloth robe. I went to my closet and pulled out a tailored pitch black suit. It was the same armor I wore to corporate board meetings when I had to terminate hostile vendor contracts. The fabric was stiff, the cut unforgiving. I secured my hair into a tight, neat style, slipped on dark leather heels, and walked back downstairs. The house was quiet again. The CIT specialist had already slipped out the side door, desperate to distance herself from the impending legal fallout. The second officer remained in my kitchen, finalizing his incident report on a small spiral notepad. I picked up my tablet from the counter. I checked the battery life indicator in the top corner. It was fully charged, holding the encrypted video files that would destroy my parents' social standing. I looked at the patrolman and told him I needed one more favor before he returned to the precinct. I requested an official police escort to the Oak Ridge Country Club. At this exact moment, my parents were hosting a lavish, performative grief luncheon for an aunt they never loved. They had rented the grand ballroom, invited 60 affluent friends, and were currently playing the role of the tragic, long-suffering relatives. They were expecting Jason to walk through those country club doors and announce my commitment to a state facility. It was time to crash the party and show their wealthy neighbors exactly who was sitting at the head table. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club took exactly 15 minutes. I sat in the passenger seat of the patrol vehicle, watching the manicured lawns and iron gates of affluent neighborhoods blur past the window. I used the transit time to make one critical phone call. I dialed Arthur Harrison, Aunt Vivian's estate attorney. I provided him with a brief factual summary of the morning's events. He did not express shock or offer empty sympathies. He simply asked for the address of the country club and told me to wait for him in the lobby. When the police cruiser pulled up to the valet stand, parking directly behind a row of imported luxury sedans, the attendants stared in open confusion. I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. Mr. Harrison was already waiting by the grand entrance. He wore a sharp gray suit and carried a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had survived 1,000 courtroom battles. We did not exchange pleasantries. He offered a single curt nod, and the three of us walked through the sliding glass doors. The contrast between the sterile police station reality and the hyper-performative world of the country club was jarring. The lobby smelled of expensive lilies and old money. We bypassed the reception desk and headed straight for the grand ballroom. Inside, my parents were hosting their lavish grief luncheon. There were at least 60 guests in attendance. Extended relatives, wealthy neighbors, and local business owners milled around circular tables draped in heavy white linen. Waiters in dark vests carried silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. It was a highly coordinated theatrical production disguised as a memorial. At the front of the room, my mother held court. Brenda wore a tailored black dress that looked more suited for a fashion runway than a funeral. She stood near the head table, dabbing the corners of her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. Beside her sat my father, Richard. He swirled a glass of amber liquor, staring blankly at the floral centerpiece. Richard was the eternal enabler. For 30 years, he allowed his wife to dictate the family narrative, stepping back into the shadows to avoid conflict. He knew his son was a massive financial liability. He knew I carried the heavy physical burden of caring for his dying sister. But intervening required effort, and Richard preferred the quiet comfort of his passive complicity. I paused just outside the open double doors, letting the low hum of the crowd wash over me. I could hear Brenda's voice carrying over the clinking of crystal glasses. She leaned close to a prominent neighbor, a woman who served on the local hospital board. Brenda spoke in a loud, deliberate whisper, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear her tragic tale. She claimed she was heartbroken. She told the neighbor her daughter could not attend the luncheon today because the grief had shattered her fragile mind. She shook her head sadly, stating the family was forced to intervene and send medical professionals to my home just a few hours ago. She called it a tragic mental breakdown. She was actively paving the runway for Jason's conservatorship petition, seeding the community with the lie of my insanity. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. They were drinking premium wine paid for by the estate of a woman they had abandoned, while publicly destroying the reputation of the woman who actually kept her alive. I placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the oak door and pushed it wide open. The hinges groaned loudly, a sharp metallic sound that sliced right through the polite murmuring of the ballroom. I stepped onto the plush carpet. The visual impact of our arrival was immediate and devastating. I walked in the center, wearing my unforgiving black corporate suit, my posture rigid and unyielding. To my left walked Arthur Harrison, radiating the cold authority of a man who dismantles fortunes for a living. To my right walked the uniformed patrolman, his duty belt heavy with equipment. He held his hand up near his chest, gripping a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the transparent plastic, the brass spare key Jason had used to breach my home rested at the bottom. The reaction swept through the room like a physical shockwave. The overlapping conversations died instantly. A waiter froze mid-step, a bottle of white wine hovering over a guest's glass. The scraping of silver forks against porcelain plates ceased entirely. The grand ballroom fell dead silent. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward the entrance, registering the police uniform, the lawyer, and the daughter who was supposed to be locked inside a psychiatric ward. Brenda looked up from her conversation. The blood drained from her face so fast her skin turned the color of ash. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She stared at the patrolman, then at the evidence bag, and finally at me. Her brain struggled to process the collapse of her timeline. Jason was supposed to be calling her right now with news of my involuntary commitment. Instead, I was standing in her private venue, flanked by the law and the executor of the estate. But my mother was a creature of relentless self-preservation. Her survival depended on maintaining the illusion at all costs. I watched her calculate her next move. She decided the only way out was to double down on the delusion. She pushed her chair back abruptly, the wooden legs grinding harshly against the floor. She rushed forward, closing the distance between the head table and the center of the room. She threw her hands up to her mouth, manufacturing a theatrical gasp. Her eyes widened in feigned horror. "Oh, sweetie!" she cried out, her voice trembling with fake emotion, echoing off the high ceilings. "You escaped the hospital? How did you get all the way out here?" She turned her frantic gaze toward the patrolman, purposely ignoring the evidence bag in his hand. She clasped her hands together in a pleading gesture. "Officers, thank goodness you found her," she pleaded loudly, making sure every guest heard her directive. "Please, you must help her. She is not well. She needs to be secured and taken back to the facility before she hurts someone." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting back and forth between the hysterical mother and the perfectly calm daughter. The patrolman did not move an inch. He looked at Brenda with an expression of profound disgust, recognizing the exact brand of manipulative performance that wastes police resources. Mr. Harrison simply adjusted his grip on his battered briefcase, his face an unreadable mask of legal stoicism. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not engage in a shouting match to prove my sanity. Arguing with a performer only validates their stage. I looked at Brenda with a cold, deadpan stare. I stepped around her, letting the silence stretch and suffocate her desperate play for control. I walked directly toward the audiovisual podium positioned beside the head table. A country club laptop rested on the stand, connected to an overhead projector. It was playing a looping memorial slideshow of Vivian's life, heavily doctored to feature numerous photos of Jason and Brenda smiling for the camera. I reached behind the wooden podium, grabbed the thick video cable, and unplugged it from their machine. The projection screen on the wall went instantly black. I unzipped my leather bag, pulled out my tablet, and pushed the cable firmly into my own device. I tapped the play button on the tablet screen. The digital connection fed the signal directly into the banquet hall surround sound system. The expensive acoustic engineering, designed to amplify polite toast and chamber music, now broadcasted the raw, unfiltered truth of my brother and mother conspiring to destroy my life. Jason's voice blasted from the ceiling-mounted speakers, sharp and clear. "Everything is set. The pills are out. The journal is open." The audio clarity was devastating. Every phonetic syllable carried over the circular tables. The waiters froze in the aisles. The ambient noise of the gathering evaporated. Then came Brenda's recorded reply. The same woman who was just weeping into a monogrammed handkerchief was now broadcasting her precise, calculated extortion. "I will call the police dispatcher tomorrow morning at 8. Brenda's recorded voice echoed off the high walls. "I will tell them she called me making violent threats." The country club guests sat frozen. Extended relatives who had just offered me their deepest sympathies stared at the ceiling, trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the betrayal. "Once she is in the psych ward," the voice continued, entirely devoid of any maternal warmth, "your lawyer files the emergency petition with the probate judge. We use the hold to prove she is unfit to inherit. The court names you her legal conservator, and we start siphoning the $4.2 million through management fees before she even gets discharged." I tapped the screen again. The audio cut out. The silence that rushed back into the room carried the weight of an anvil. Objective reality is a heavy thing to witness. The wealthy socialites and extended family members did not murmur. They recoiled. A woman in the front row, an aunt who had always favored Jason, physically pushed her chair away from the head table. The metal legs scraped loudly against the floor. The local hospital board member, the influential neighbor Brenda had been whispering to moments prior, stood up and took a long, deliberate step backward. Brenda recognized the social exile happening in real time. Her status, the social currency she valued above her own children, was incinerating right in front of her. The polite, grieving mask shattered into 1,000 pieces. She lunged forward. She threw her body across the space between the head table and the podium, her hands clawing for the tablet. Her manicured nails scraped against the polished wood of the stand. I did not flinch. I simply took a step to the side, pulling the device out of her reach. She stumbled, catching her balance against the podium, her carefully styled hair falling across her face. She turned to the crowd, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. She pointed a shaking finger at me and began to scream. She claimed the audio was fabricated. She shouted the words deep fake and artificial intelligence, grasping at modern tech buzzwords to explain away the undeniable evidence. She yelled that I worked in corporate data, that I possessed the advanced skills to manipulate digital files to frame my own family. She begged her friends to believe I had brainwashed Vivian during her final years, isolating the dying woman to steal the fortune for myself. Her performance was desperate, loud, and entirely devoid of logic. I watched her spiral. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I did not defend my character to a room full of people who had ignored me for a decade. I let her flail against the cold facts. The contrast between my rigid emotional restraint and her hysterical flailing told the audience everything they needed to know. Arthur Harrison stepped into the space Brenda had just vacated. He did not yell over her screams. He possessed the quiet, commanding presence of a man accustomed to directing federal courtrooms. He cleared his throat. The low, gravelly sound commanded instant attention, cutting through Brenda's manic denials. He addressed the 60 guests gathered in the ballroom. He introduced himself as the executor of the Vivian estate. He spoke with measured, deliberate pacing. He confirmed the audio they just heard was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of a felony conspiracy. He stated that Jason was currently sitting in police custody, facing multiple criminal charges for planting narcotics in my residence early this morning. Then, he turned his focus directly onto Brenda. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket. It was the notarized testament. He formally announced the existence of the no contest clause. He explained a specific addendum Vivian had drafted regarding medical sabotage. His voice left no room for debate or appeal. He declared that by participating in a fraudulent psychiatric intervention, Brenda and Jason had provided him with the exact timestamp evidence required to activate the penalty. He stated he would be filing an expedited petition with the probate judge first thing Monday morning to formally strip them of their token bequests. With a felony arrest and a recorded confession broadcasted to 60 witnesses, the court's ruling would be a mere formality. They were legally barred from challenging the probate process. They had gambled their safety net on a hostile takeover, and they were about to lose every single cent. For the first time in my adult life, my father spoke up. Richard pushed himself up from his chair. His face was flushed, his hands trembling as he gripping the edge of the linen-covered table. He was a man who spent 3 decades retreating to his golf cart to avoid his wife's toxic behavior. He had watched them hand Jason $200,000 while I worked night shifts to pay for my own textbooks. Now, forced into the center of a public scandal, his primary instinct was still to sweep the damage under the rug. He looked at me with pleading eyes. He begged me to stop the presentation. He called the entire morning a massive misunderstanding. He asked me to drop the criminal charges against his son, to fire the estate lawyer, and to handle the dispute privately behind closed doors. He used the exact phrase abusers rely on to maintain their control. He asked me not to destroy the family over money. Richard's final plea, a desperate call to handle the dispute privately, seemed to hang in the air, a physical weight that made the low murmur of the ballroom feel like a roar. I didn't immediately answer. My posture remained rigid, but for an infinite second, a vacancy took over my eyes. I didn't look at him with anger or hatred. I just looked through him, with the same clear, unblinking though suet vision I had trained for years on analyzing network breaches. It was the look I had given the empty shell of Aunt Vivian in her final weeks. A look that accepts a death that has already happened. In that silence, the 40-year-old illusion of father dissolved forever. I didn't see a patriarch. I saw a cornered, sniveling accountant trying to budget the truth with a checkbook that was already empty. A single, cold, crystal-clear thought settled into my mind. Aunt Vivian was not my last connection to a family. Vivian was the only family I ever had. I realized I hadn't lost a family today. I was just finally acknowledging the truth of the last 35 years. I had been Mokoi from the very beginning. Only then did I force my voice to become a mechanical flatline, ensuring every guest heard the final judgment. "I did not destroy this family, Richard," I said, my voice ice. "You destroyed it the second you decided my sanity was a disposable asset. I am merely holding up a mirror to the wreckage you created." The finality of my statement hung in the air. The realization that there was no negotiation, no secret settlement, finally pierced Brenda's panic. The hysterical denial vanished, replaced by a bitter, venomous sneer. She straightened her posture and smoothed her black dress. She looked at the surrounding tables, trying to salvage a shred of dignity from the ashes of her reputation. She tilted her chin upward. She stated that the inheritance did not matter. She claimed they did not need Vivian's handouts anyway. They were affluent. They were secure. She announced loudly that they still had their own investments, their own pristine reputation, and their own luxury home in the gated community. They would cut their losses and walk away from this ungrateful daughter. Mr. Harrison remained perfectly still. He let her arrogant declaration ring out into the quiet ballroom. He waited a beat, letting her words settle into the minds of her peers. Then he unlatched the brass clasps on his battered leather briefcase. He reached inside and pulled out a thick-sealed manila envelope. He looked at Brenda with an expression of cold, professional pity. The attorney held the thick envelope by its edges. He tapped it against the side of the wooden podium. The rhythmic thud drew every eye in the room. Brenda had just staked her entire remaining dignity on the bricks and mortar of her Florida estate. She believed her gated community provided an impenetrable shield against the consequences of her actions. She assumed her wealth made her untouchable. She was wrong. Arthur Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not need volume to command the sprawling space. He slid his thumb under the adhesive flap of the envelope and tore it open. The tearing of heavy paper echoed like a zipper opening in a silent theater. He extracted a crisp, watermarked legal document bearing a raised county seal. He adjusted his reading glasses, looking over the metal rims directly at my mother. He addressed her boast head-on. He noted her pride in her property, her mention of her pristine reputation, and her claim of independent wealth. Then he dismantled it all with clinical precision. He explained to the listening ballroom that 10 years ago, Richard and Brenda encountered a catastrophic financial crisis. They had over-leveraged their assets to fund a lifestyle they could not sustain. They were 90 days away from a public, devastating foreclosure. Their country club membership, their imported luxury vehicles, their social standing were all scheduled to be repossessed by the bank. To avoid the crippling humiliation of public bankruptcy, they went to Vivian. They begged the sister they secretly despised for a massive bailout. Vivian agreed, but she was a hardened logistics executive. She did not hand out unsecured loans to irresponsible relatives. She executed a quiet, brutal real estate transaction. She purchased the deed to their luxury home outright, paying off the holding bank in full. For a decade, my parents had not owned a single square foot of that property. They were guests. They were tenants living rent-free under the roof of the woman they had just tried to rob. The revelation landed like a physical blow across the tables. The wealthy neighbors exchanged wide-eyed glances. In circles like this, financial ruin is the ultimate sin. The illusion of their prosperity was shattered. The people they had tried to impress, the peers they had lied to all morning, now knew they were frauds surviving on charity. A low murmur finally broke through the quiet, the sound of reputations dissolving in real time. Harrison was not finished. He unfolded a second page from the stack. It was the final addendum to the trust. Vivian was a master strategist. She knew her sister's greed would eventually target me. She knew Brenda and Jason viewed me as an obstacle. So, she built a fail-safe into the foundation of her estate. Harrison read the clause verbatim. The legal phrasing was airtight, forged in the fires of corporate litigation. It stipulated that should Richard or Brenda attempt to contest the final will, or bring any form of physical, legal, or medical harm to her niece Olivia, the deed to the Florida residence would immediately transfer into my name. It granted me absolute authority to terminate their tenancy at my sole discretion. The trap was finally visible in its terrifying entirety. The $4.2 million liquid fortune was never the actual target. It was the bait. Vivian dangled a massive pile of cash in front of them, knowing they lacked the moral restraint to ignore it. She knew they would orchestrate a scheme to take it from me. The house was the snare, waiting to snap shut the exact moment they made their aggressive move. Brenda walked right into it, dragging Jason and Richard down with her into the dark. The math was inescapable. They had not just forfeited the cash inheritance. They had not just sent their golden child to a holding cell facing multiple felony charges. They had literally made themselves homeless. They traded their shelter for a failed extortion plot. The realization hit Brenda with the force of a descending freight train. The arrogant sneer melted off her face, replaced by a mask of pure terror. Her knees buckled under her weight. She reached out to grab the edge of the linen-covered table, her fingers slipping uselessly against the smooth fabric. She collapsed hard into her chair. Her shoulders shook violently. A loud, guttural wail ripped from her throat. It was a raw, primal sound, entirely devoid of the calculated theatricality she had displayed earlier. For the very first time in my life, I watched my mother cry genuine tears. She was weeping for the loss of her only true love. Her status. Richard stood paralyzed beside her. His jaw hung slack. He looked at the attorney, then down at his weeping wife, his passive complicity finally yielding a consequence he could not ignore. He had kept the peace for 30 years, and the price of that peace was his own ruin. The guests began to stand up. They did not offer condolences. They were quietly gathering their coats and expensive purses, eager to escape the radioactive fallout of an exposed fraud. The chairs scraped against the carpet as the ballroom emptied, leaving the head table isolated in the center of the vast room. The luncheon was over. The performance had officially closed. Arthur Harrison stepped down from the wooden podium. He walked over to where I stood near the audiovisual equipment. He handed me a heavy clipboard holding a single sheet of paper. He handed me a black ink pen. It was a formal 30-day notice of eviction, drafted under the authority of my new property deed, legally binding in the state of Florida. I took the pen. I clicked the top, the sharp mechanical sound piercing through Brenda's sobbing. I signed my name on the bottom line, my signature steady and dark against the white page. I walked toward the head table. My mother was slumped over, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with every breath. I did not offer a comforting word. I did not tell her everything would be okay. I placed the clipboard gently onto the table, setting it right next to her untouched garden salad. I did not wait for a response or a final apology. I turned my back on the head table and walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. Arthur Harrison fell into step beside me, his briefcase secured firmly in his grip. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, instantly muting the sound of my mother sobbing over her untouched lunch. We stepped out of the air-conditioned lobby and back into the bright, humid reality of the Florida afternoon. The valet brought the patrol car around to the front curb. As I slid into the passenger seat and closed the heavy door, I looked at the pristine white columns of the country club one last time. I did not feel a sudden surge of adrenaline or a triumphant thrill. I only felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion wash over my entire body. I had survived a brutal, calculated war I never asked to fight. The real-world consequences of weaponizing the legal system against an innocent person are severe and unforgiving. The justice system often moves at a glacial pace, but undeniable high-definition video evidence drastically accelerates the timeline. Jason spent 3 uncomfortable nights sitting in a county holding cell before a local bail bondsman agreed to accept his wife's vehicle as collateral. He hired a flashy, expensive defense attorney, operating under the delusion that he could charm or negotiate his way out of a felony indictment. That arrogant strategy evaporated during the preliminary hearing. The district attorney did not even bother to argue. The prosecutor simply played the crisp audio recording of my brother and mother planning a medical kidnapping. The defense attorney recognized the losing battle. He pulled Jason into the hallway and strongly advised him to accept a plea agreement before the district attorney added conspiracy and extortion to the charge sheet. My brother stood before a hardened criminal court judge and verbally admitted his guilt. He pleaded guilty to prescription drug fraud and filing a false police report. Because he was a first-time offender, he avoided a long prison sentence, receiving 3 years of highly restricted supervised probation instead. However, the felony conviction acted as a permanent death sentence for his professional ambitions. You cannot secure venture capital for tech startups when your background check reveals a criminal history of fraud and narcotics possession. His current investors pulled their funding within 24 hours of the news breaking. His business partners severed all ties. 2 weeks later, his wife filed for divorce, citing his hidden debts and criminal behavior as irreconcilable differences. Jason was forced to move out of his comfortable suburban home and into a cheap weekly rental motel near the interstate. His golden boy status was entirely stripped away, reduced to a criminal record number and a court-mandated curfew. The dismantling of my parents' lives was a much quieter, slower procedure. The eviction of Brenda and Richard was executed with methodical precision. Brenda spent the first week calling every prominent law firm in the county, desperate to find a loophole in the trust addendum. The 30-day deadline arrived without an ounce of mercy. I did not attend the physical move-out process. I hired a private security firm to oversee the property transfer and ensure no damage was done to the interior. The security director reported that Brenda supervised the hired movers in complete silence, hiding her red, swollen eyes behind oversized, dark sunglasses. The wealthy neighbors in the gated community stood on their manicured lawns, watching the moving trucks pack up 30 years of carefully curated social status. Brenda and Richard relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment located on the industrial side of the city. The rent was cheap, the drywall was thin, and their only view consisted of a crowded, cracked asphalt parking lot. Their country club membership was formally revoked due to unpaid monthly dues. Their affluent friends, terrified of being associated with a public scandal, simply stopped returning their phone calls. For a woman whose entire existence revolved around social currency and public perception, the sudden, absolute exile was a fate significantly worse than financial poverty. They became invisible ghosts in a city they used to rule. People often assume that dismantling your abusers brings a rush of vindictive joy. Audiences expect a cinematic ending where the protagonist smiles victoriously as their enemies fall into ruin. That is a cinematic myth. Real-life healing does not look like that. There was no joy in my victory. There was only the solemn, quiet relief of a survivor finally walking away from a burning building. I did not celebrate their downfall. I grieved the harsh realization that the family I was born into viewed my sanity as a disposable asset. I mourned the parents I never truly possessed. But beneath the heavy grief, I felt the solid, unshakable foundation of my own autonomy. The crushing burden of being the invisible, reliable child was permanently lifted off my shoulders. 30 days after the eviction, I put the luxury estate on the market. Without the dark cloud of my parents' performative lifestyle haunting the halls, the property sold incredibly fast to a retired couple from New York. The sale generated a substantial financial premium. I did not keep a single dollar of the real estate profits for my own personal use. I took the entire sum and rolled it directly into Vivian's existing trust account. I wanted to honor the woman who recognized my worth and engineered my ultimate protection from the grave. I contacted a National Medical Research Foundation dedicated to eradicating severe neurological decline. I scheduled a formal meeting with their board of directors. I sat in their conference room and signed a massive 7-figure donation check. The money funded a brand new research wing dedicated entirely to late-stage dementia care and cognitive studies. A heavy bronze plaque bearing Vivian's name was mounted near the entrance. Her legacy would create actual, tangible healing, rather than funding my brother's fraudulent schemes or my mother's country club tabs. I returned to my corporate data career, but I drastically changed every parameter of my personal life. I hired Mr. Harrison to draft and legally serve formal cease and desist orders to every surviving blood relative. I changed my personal phone number. I upgraded the surveillance security protocols on my property to ensure my physical safety. I permanently stopped attending obligatory holiday gatherings where psychological tension was served alongside the main course. Instead, I built a chosen family. I surrounded myself with trusted colleagues, loyal friends, and professional mentors who valued my intellect rather than my utility. My home became a genuine sanctuary of peace, completely untainted by the exhausting demands of toxic obligations. Keeping the peace with toxic people only funds your own destruction. Silence is the currency abusers use to buy their comfort at the expense of your sanity. If you refuse to play the role they assign to you, they will attempt to burn your stage to the ground. Let them try. You built the stage and you hold the deed. If you had to choose between protecting your family's secrets and protecting your own sanity, which would you choose? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories, and remember, always keep the receipts. It has been 2 years since I slid that 30-day eviction notice across the white linen tablecloth and walked out of the country club. The quiet inside my house is no longer the tense, suffocating stillness of waiting for the next family crisis. It is the steady, unbothered rhythm of a life completely under my own jurisdiction. The high-definition cameras still run, silently logging data to the encrypted cloud, but I rarely check the dashboard anymore. The threat has been permanently neutralized. My mother still resides in that cramped, thin-walled apartment by the industrial park, completely erased from the high society circle she worshipped. Jason is currently working night shifts at a fulfillment warehouse, his arrogant tech founder facade replaced by the heavy, inescapable reality of a felony record and supervised probation. I do not monitor their circumstances to gloat. I simply acknowledge their current reality as the inevitable mathematics of their own malicious choices. Looking back at the wreckage they created, I realized that surviving them required a fundamental rewiring of how I viewed loyalty. The concept of keeping the peace is often just a trap designed to keep the victim compliant. Blood is a biological accident, but true family is a conscious, earned choice. Vivian's legacy thrives in the new medical research wing and in the profound peace I wake up to every single morning. I did not just survive their attempt to bury me, I used the dirt they threw to build an impenetrable foundation for the rest of my life. Thank you for tuning into Sweet Karma Life. Navigating toxic family dynamics is a brutal journey, but you do not have to walk it alone. If this narrative gave you the courage to finally set a difficult boundary, please hit the like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, what was the exact moment you realized you had to walk away from a toxic relative? Remember, the truth always comes to light, especially when you keep the receipts.